Good evening and welcome to Nietzsche 10:13. It has been said that Luce Irigaray's Amante Marine, translated in English as Marine Lover of Friedrich Nietzsche, is an opaque work. As Johann Faulkner puts it in one of the articles suggested for this session, Irigaray intended her readers to come to her text with their homework done. She does not quote textual references. She does not inscribe herself in the history of philosophy. She does not present a philosophical argument that she intends to pursue. And she definitely does not present the philosophical or authoritative genealogy of such argument. It does not mean, as Kelly Oliver has demonstrated, that Irigaray, it's a Basque last name, although she's Belgian, places herself outside the philosophical traditions, outside the philosophical debates that are taking place in her intellectual universe. On the contrary, she holds a sustained discussion with thinkers that may be absent in name, but who are inscribed, tattooed in her text with their conceptual contributions and analytical tools. What seems interesting to me is the power of this movement in itself, its inherent energy of cleaning up the desk with the names that constitute the philosophical history of the West in order to focus on the moment of the address in the conversation itself, in which there are only these two interlocutors. Those are the ones that will philosophize, even if that entails a careful surgery to extract the Historia Philosophorum. Instead of all the explicit professional discourse, the philosophical poem can be seen as a moment of recognition in which the one who gives an account of herself engages in a conversation with the male philosopher afraid of the sea, afraid of water altogether, and who does not expect the moment of recognition itself to ever arrive. To read Irigaray from this perspective, I found illuminating the following words of Judith Butler. My narrative, she says, begins in medias res, when many things have already taken place to make me and my story in language possible. And it means that my story always arrives late. I am always recuperating, reconstructing, even as I produce myself differently in the very act of telling. My account of myself is partial, haunted by that for which I have no definitive story. I hesitate to say that the Marine Lover's account arrives late to anything. It is mostly the one addressed as vous, or addressed as tu, the male philosopher who arrives late to the story and to history altogether. It is because of this that Irigaray's philosophical poetic voice, Ariadne, wants to delve into the technologies of the philosopher's self by, first of all, interpreting his dreams. I want to interpret your midnight dreams and unmask that phenomenon, your night, and make you admit that I dwell in it as your most fearsome adversity, so that you can finally realize what your greatest resentment is, and so that with you I can fight to make the earth my own and stop allowing myself to be a slave to your nature, and so that you finally stop wanting to be the only God. This paragraph is not only a philosophical desire in that crucial moment of recognition, it is as well one of the moments in which the auto-philosopher, as the account is given in the first person, deploys the philosophical language and the philosophical style of the male philosopher in front of him, against, or him, as it were. She thinks with this language, thinks with this style, thinks with the metaphors and the concepts of the male philosopher to make the critique of his own critique. Return, resentment, power, will, all those concepts are subject to the poetic microanalysis of the auto-philosopher with the purpose to think what scares the male philosopher, not earth, but water, le féminin, and even the exegesis of the incarnation, the birth of the gods. In a sense, she proposes a different history of humankind. To speak about this formidable critical thinker that is Luce Irigaray, we have invited the main specialists. We are happy to have today with us Penelope Deutscher and Kelly Oliver. Penelope Deutscher is professor of philosophy at Northwestern University. She specializes in 20th century and contemporary French philosophy and in gender and sexuality studies. Current projects are focused on the intersection of biopolitics, reproductive futurism, and the genealogy of gendered rights claims. Her forthcoming books include Foucault's Children, The Reproduction of Biopolitics, and two co-edited collections, Foucault-Derrida, 50 Years On, and Critical Theory in Critical Times. She is also the author of Yielding Gender, Feminism, The Construction and the History of Philosophy, The Politics of Impossible Difference, the later work of Irigaray, How to Read Derrida, and The Philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir, Ambiguity, Conversion, and Resistance. Kelly Oliver is the W. Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt University. Her authored books include most recently Hunting Girls, Sexual Violence from the Hunger Games to Campus Rape, which is forthcoming from Columbia University Press, Earth and World, Philosophy After the Apollo Missions, Technologies of Life and Death, From Cloning to Capital Punishment, Knock Me Up, Knock Me Down, Images of Pregnancy in Hollywood Film, and many, many other books. And most recently, she has written 2 novels in the Cowgirl Philosophy series. Then, Patricia Dailey, my dear friends, Patricia Dailey and Bernard Harcourt will be kind enough to engage in a fruitful conversation with our guests. Today we are lucky to count with all of you, thank you for coming, and we are lucky to have a special guest who is going to conduct tomorrow an extra 1313 session. It's Professor Rüdiger Bidner from the University of Bielefeld, who is a specialist in the work of Nietzsche and the editor of Nietzsche's Nachlass for Cambridge University Press, and has written books that include lately Doing Things for Reasons, Fiktionen der Gerechtigkeit, and Moralische Erzählungen. Thank you all for coming to this session, and thank you to our guests for being so kind to participate in this, and please join me in welcoming them. Penelope.
We found that Kelly and I, as we were looking back at Irigaray, that the reading of Nietzsche was looking back, thinking about Thanks. I was looking at Marine Lover and thinking, what kind of exchange is this finally with Nietzsche? And I appreciated Hazis's introduction very much because of its asking that question as well. You know, really what kind of an encounter is it that Irigaray is having with Nietzsche? And looking back, I was thinking, how satisfactory do I find it at this time? And I'll say a few words about that, and then I know Kelly's going to take things through vegetal being, and so we'll hear from Irigaray again, and it's like a later response to Nietzsche, and then we can put them together and think about her trajectory through to the problem of Earth. So I just wanted to remind you of some questions that Nietzsche might take to be good questions. And I think most of the response this evening is formulated around just that question, what is a good question? So what are some good questions for Nietzsche? For example, questions that he asked about history in Untimely Meditations. Is history good for life? And as he more generally asked that kind of question, how can we give attention to the shape and the conduct of forms of thought, knowledge, belief, subjectivity, and to the multiple variations in those forms? And if we cultivate, if we can, the sensibility for distinguishing such forms, even questions such as how history can be monumental or antiquarian or critical, then what criteria do we bring to those variations? How well equipped are we to distinguish those variations? How well equipped are we to evaluate them? What senses do we use when we do that? What's our conduct of critique? How, in other words, do we bring those variations into the space of criticisability? How do we connect our sensitivity to them, to an expansion of possibilities and tactics of critique, and also to our own best potential for transformation and becoming otherwise? If I think of those as good questions from Nietzsche, then they hang over our understanding of the encounter between Nietzsche and Irigaray, given that it might most obviously be framed by what's said by Nietzsche of femininity, of women, young and old, and women's rights and love and marriage and sexual difference. I don't need to remind you of the Nietzschean passages about women to which feminists and others have objected, and it's not surprising that Irigaray would be among those critics. And it's clear from Marine Lover that Irigaray is among those critics, but I'm going to suggest that the best potential for the exchange between Irigaray and Nietzsche isn't there. So it's interesting all the same if we think about women as savage and superficial and performing, as enemies, as those who should bear the overman, not be the overman, as those who might not be capable of friendship. If we think about those sorts of very famous comments about women made by Nietzsche, it's interesting that Irigaray's response to Nietzsche isn't really organised by that attention to those remarks. So it's not those remarks which are really governing the response that she makes to Nietzsche. It's not really the confinements of women or the dismissals or the diatribes about women. You could think of the responses organised methodologically and in content by a different form of critique, a different strategy of critique. Perhaps one asking, what is the right question to direct to those kinds of representations of sexual difference, and to women, what kind of strategy should we take? So let's move back up again to what Nietzsche might take to be that right question. It's true that he never distinguished modes of femininity and modes of sexual difference with that organised and differentiated approach that he brought to, say, modes of history. But just as one could about truth and morality and metaphysics and different variants of nationalism and history, we do see him offering different accounts of women that would operate as dispersed equivalents of that capacity to differentiate types of history, the monumental, the antiquarian, the critical, and their positive and their negative variants. And we're offered various typologies of femininity and relations to sexual difference. And we're given closer attention to the effects of those variants, which themselves have in any case only emerged within specific conditions. And we're given attention to the question of how they can act on others, and associated questions of whether those variants are good or bad for life. Often enough, of course, the answer is negative, and we'll hear that women are weak or reactive. And then the right question for Nietzsche might be, well, what are the effects? And we might hear Nietzsche's assessment that women make the strong weak, or that a woman rules when she succeeds in overdoing the strong. But often enough we'll learn that a woman can have another effect, with the art of grace, of play, of chasing away worries, of lightening burdens, and taking things lightly, her subtle attitude for agreeable desires. And you'll know that there are a good many more women, many negative variations. But you'll know also that Nietzsche also imagines positive possibilities of friendship or healthy antagonism or enemy relations, allowing a mutual increase of forces between the sexes. Only emerging, like all humans and all entities, under certain conditions, how women can be characterised is as much a characterisation by Nietzsche of what is sought from women by particular formations and types of men. We learn much from both Nietzsche and Irigaray about the limit entities that men might have come to become, from what they tend to expect of women, just as we'll learn similarly from what they might expect or ask of metaphysics or truth or history or science or religion. Most obviously, we find Nietzsche offering a critical account of how women emerge as men's ideal, an account that fits into his critique of whether idols and ideals are good for life. And on that point also, there's a degree of sympathy between the Nietzschean and early Irigarayan gestures of critique, in that for both, a concentration on what's sought from metaphysics or science or religion or sexual difference can be retaken, as it is by both, as a kind of symptomology, an indication of limited or self-stunting formations of subjects. I mean by that Irigaray is not entirely out of sync with Nietzsche's sensibility. when she will rethink the positively depicted variants of women's artistry and their action at a distance and their capacity to work the vital effects of power and charm, no less than the negative versions, and suggest that those are nonetheless passages through death, as she wants to suggest. Even if we were to wish, quoting here, even if we were to wish to be wholly assimilated in it, this show doesn't suit her, cannot manifest her, and Irigaray concludes, we might need a new physiology of art to interpret her ambience, for which the perspective might not necessarily be the fundamental condition of all life, but that which already mummifies life. So Irigaray introduces this possibility of a mummification of life in both the positive and the negative versions of women that we get from Nietzsche. The question, good for life, would lead Irigaray to interrogate critically its anonymity, to suggest that it's not in fact as anonymous as it seems, for women's capacity to work effects are largely assessed only insofar as those effects are being worked on men. And it's not just that the question good for life is going to look different when the interrogation of impact on whom is more evenly distributed, or at least the questions asked. There's also the fact that life itself, as she's pointing out, is so often being given by Nietzsche feminine connotations, suggesting the very problematic could be understood by Irigaray as just the very problematic itself. The question good for life is itself an appropriation of the feminine to those ends, and an alternative to a recognition of the maternal as life-giving. Moreover, Irigaray explores different senses of life as seem to be at work when Irigaray suggests that sometimes what emerges in a Nietzschean framework as good for life might be bad for women's potential, for their possible transformation, for their lives in that sense, and more abstractly for sexual difference, mummifying in that sense also. So we start to think that we might need different senses of life in addition to more even-handed perspectives on good for. Irigaray gives attention to the life one might associate with origins, the sea and the rudimentary creatures, maternal in particular. That's why the philosophy oriented towards the Übermensch is in Irigaray's sense no more than flying over life. It's partly because the life they have in mind is different. And I've suggested that by giving attention to what for each of them would be the right question to direct at formations of women and sexual difference, it's thinking about this that we'll find the most interesting dialogue. I don't think that the dialogue then is most interesting when it's an interrogation of what's actually said about women by Nietzsche. Instead, it's this question of what is the right question, and Irigaray formulates this in the following way: what is the question appropriate to women? And she'll say, now woman is not one, and reducing the outside marks the limit of the method of questioning. Not identical to self, the woman does not answer one question. The question that would be appropriate to her is always and forever impossible to formulate, even if one wanted to make the effort. Irigaray displaces Nietzsche's awareness that woman is not one. For Nietzsche also women are multiple, but in elaborating that view, Irigaray will still see Nietzsche as committed to variations of a version of woman that is effectively for man, or for effects for man, or for the future of man. Those are among Irigaray's responses to Nietzsche and Marine Lover, but the strategy isn't evident. She's not taking that direct tone of hostility or mockery. She's minimising citation of Nietzsche, as we heard, minimising citation of Nietzsche's actual comments about women. And she's adopting a number of possible personae or hypothetical speaking positions for a denied femininity or sexual difference. She's offering a critique of myths of being born directly from the forehead of male gods, from ribs of men, or through immaculate conception, or from thighs, and of the secondary, denied, appropriated role attributed to women by Plato or Christianity or Greek mythology. Tying together her responses, it's the account of an appropriation of female origins, a denial of that debt, leading Irigaray to describe woman as the abyss. So we'll take it that for Irigaray, maternal origins and the abyss of sexual difference are going to be the most intolerable for Nietzsche. I'm just going to read one passage from the response to Zarathustra in Marine Lover, just to give you a sense of the address, which isn't a concentration on what's being said of women. And here the passage responds to a relationship that's set up between the feminine and the sea. And so Nietzsche's going to respond to Nietzsche from this persona that she's adopting. I'm sorry? 44. I'm sorry, 37 to 38. 37 to 38. Yeah, of the English, if you're on the English, yeah. Isn't streaming into the sea, going back to the spring from whence you've sprung? Why be so horrified at the prospect? Why wouldn't you drink from your first nurse? And if you had never returned to that nurse, where is your source? Where have you drawn what flows out of you? Isn't it by forgetting the first waters that you achieve immersion in your abysses and the giddy flight of one who wings far away, perched at such heights that no sap rises there and no thread secures his way? Could it be that the unexplored reaches of the furthest ocean, the farthest ocean, are now your most dangerous beyond? So just to think here about the images of danger and the suggestion that what's being said about the possibility of Zarathustra's animal friend being the sea creature, that question of whether or not Zarathustra will take as a friend a sea creature is then connected to the status of the sea, the status of women, and a threat of the sea being a threat of women, and a connection of origin from the sea and origin from women, and all of that bundled together with a sense of depth, hostility, fear, and then an imagery of flying over as somehow a wariness of the earthly, the material, and the waterly, and woman as a waterly origin. So that's how Irigaray's working, that's how she's responding to Nietzsche. I wanted then to come back to the critique that's offered by Kelly of Nietzsche, described meticulously in Womanising Nietzsche, and to think again about what Irigaray undertakes in the mode of critique. She takes up a speaking position corresponding to disavowed maternal, sisterly, elemental and feminine origins, and that's to speak from the sea, is to take up a position of denied feminine alterity, for whom figures such as Ariadne, Diadema, Athena, Persephone, Cora are stand-ins. I think of the gesture that's so characteristic of Irigaray's work, and which is directed to Nietzsche to revisit what's said by a philosopher of women, of femininity, in this indirect way. To point out that all these statements amount to a subordination of woman, as she says in Marine Lover, an appropriation of the matter that woman must be, so as to then become the substance of what she becomes for man. First quote, I was your resonance, merely the drum at 3. I was your resonance, merely the drum in your own ear, sending back to itself its own truth. Today I was this woman, tomorrow that one, but never the woman who at the echo holds herself back, never the beyond that you're listening to right now. And again, you've always trapped me in your web. So the woman is either property, my body divided up neatly into neatly ruled sections, each of them is allotted to one private owner or another, each man claiming the whole. Or else she's seen as what's been appropriated to the ends of a making of woman for man. So woman as fabric, drum, echo, mirror having been appropriated. Irigaray is working with a notion of disavowed debt, a reference which is quite constant to disavowed debt with respect to the kind of life whose possibility comes from the other. You might say that life is not just a different thing, but the problem of a different conduct in each case. For Nietzsche, it's the problem of enhancing, affirming, becoming stimulation. But for Irigaray, it's a problem of recognition, of indebtedness, of affirming and intertwining. And it's finding alternatives to the wish to master. Think of how, with another balance of truth, Nietzsche will describe the most abyssal thought, the hardest thought, eternal recurrence. Would we will life again? Would we say once more? Inserting herself at the limit of Nietzsche's depictions of women, Irigaray suggests that the abyss here is sexual difference, not eternal recurrence. And she sees in eternal recurrence an aversion to recognising maternal origins, an interest in proposing alternative narratives of origin and autonomy, and the thorough exclusion of a conceptual field within which woman would be the access to man-made truths. So where Nietzsche's Zarathustra will take us into eternal recurrence as the abyssal thought, and that will become a proposition for how to understand life, Irigaray will see eternal recurrence quite differently, as an autological desire and a denial of interconnection with women as the condition of living. Quote, and your whole will, your eternal recurrence, at 26, your whole will, your eternal recurrence, are these anything more than the dream of one who neither wants to have been born nor to continue being born at every instant of a female other. So Irigaray then is going to think of a repudiation of maternal origins, and she's going to bring eternal recurrence into the remarks that she'll make about myth or about Christianity, a situation of origins from male foreheads or ribs or immaculate conceptions. If she's right in her interpretation of eternal recurrence, imagine that she was, then eternal recurrence wouldn't allow a new form of affirmation. It wouldn't, in that sense, be creative. It will be more like the kind of comments that Nietzsche makes about immaculate perception. To gaze on life without desire is to fail to love the earth as jubilation or creation. And so eternal recurrence actually would be available for the kind of humour that Nietzsche directs at the ladder and the Antichrist. A dogma of immaculate conception into the bargain, says Nietzsche, not so far from Irigaray, but it has thereby emasculated conception. So again, Nietzsche, a dogma of immaculate conception into the bargain, but it has thereby emasculated conception. The point is that there are modes of Nietzschean critique that are available for the accounts of women and femininity, in which one might say Nietzsche as speaking voice also becomes ensnared. Say that Irigaray then was right, as I suggested. Just imagine that she was about eternal recurrence as an expression of aversion to alterity and maternal origins. Even if so, Nietzsche would hardly disagree that many depictions of the feminine are instigated by attempts to convert to possession what is feared. That's to say, the kind of critique there isn't one that Nietzsche needs to be aversive to. And Nietzsche, or Irigaray, might recognise that Nietzsche's astute critique of constructions of women could be mobilised into the interests of auto-critique. But she'd likely respond that even so, the terms would be unsatisfactory, too limited from her perspective, because however devastating, it would still be limited to the terms of critique that Nietzsche's favouring. And for her part, Irigaray is introducing a different field of critique. And I'll suggest that insofar as it responds to Nietzsche, it's governed by 4 terms. Among these, the terminology of debt that Oliver observes in her response, that Nietzsche's reading, as she says, is full of metaphors of economy, as when she asks, how does man finance the death of the other, the death of his other? As when Marine Lover claims, she stakes him in a new game without his needing to borrow from the kitty, and therefore to go in debt, risk losing, at 79. A language of debt, of finance, of mortgaging, imbues the account of mothers, daughters, and the account of them, providing a resource or material out of which Irigaray suggests the various women of Nietzsche, or of a masculine imaginary, are fabricated. If women are performing, then can we speak of a debt to them? So that's first, and then secondly, there's a language of forgetting and silencing of the other. Third, it becomes an ethics insofar as the feminine's associated with the call of alterity and Nietzsche's inability to heed it. And fourth, Irigaray's text would call for the need for a different kind of creativity, not referring to alternative truths of women, but innovating from a starting point located in what Nietzsche and others would seem to find intolerable, and generating a hypothetical feminine voice from those positions of exclusion or appropriation or seeming intolerability. Understood as a form of critique, the creative gestures of generating those voices intersect with a critical mode expressed as concern with, as I suggested, appropriation, mastery, indebtedness, intolerability, ethics. So when Nietzsche will point out that a doctrine of immaculate conception maculates conception, Irigaray will find a denial of debt to the mother and appropriation of woman. But Nietzsche will be sniffing out the disgust, and you could think about how different those kinds of responses are as basis for critique. Looking back, it led me to think that finally it's not the most satisfying dialogue, not as satisfying as it could be, but I think that could be as an interesting one. Because Irigaray is working with an alternative framework that could push back against some of the languages and frameworks that she's mobilising. It could push back, in fact, against the economics. It could push back against the language of ethics, debt, forgetting, intolerability. And so one of the possibilities for opening discussion could be the suggestion that this is an encounter in which both protagonists are articulating their own limits. For all the directions ventured by Irigaray, it seems to me she doesn't venture a critical consideration of the respective limits of their understanding of critique. She engages the appropriations of women, the denial of debt, the refusal of alterity, the abhorrence of origin. But it's helpful to think about this as not just an account of an absent and impossible sexual difference, but also a conduct of critique. And then to ask, what is that conduct? If the hypothetical voice of an excluded feminine is one of forgetting, silencing, appropriation, indebtedness, then we could suggest that Irigaray does find a limit as a gesture of critique. And I mean by finding the limit at that point that those modes, to think about silencing, to think about forgetting, to think about appropriation, to speak from appropriation, aren't subjected to the gesture of critique. I just mean by that limit of critique. They're not given their own history or genealogy as gestures of critique. They're not a form of critique that at that point in Irigaray's work are available for critique. We could imagine a Nietzschean interrogation putting some pressure on the language of debt, appropriation, forgetting and the silencing of excess. He might have ventured some remark, who knows, debt, but will we find a good prospect for creativity in the position of the creditor? So it's not that I really want to question the language of appropriation or debt, but more to suggest that at the point at which Irigaray deploys it, it's just at that point, it seems to me, that critique stops short and finds that limit, that at that point, and only in that sense, it becomes uncritical. To be sure that Nietzsche offers his critique of the feminist, so he does, but I'm thinking about the further possibilities for prodding each other. I'm thinking about a different kind of way of understanding the relation between Nietzsche and Irigaray, a different way in which they could have prodded each other, perhaps even into further possibilities for critique of critique. And in getting there, I don't think it's not what Nietzsche actually says about either the feminine or indeed of the feminist that will help us get there, and that's a good insight from Irigaray. So again, it's interesting that she avoids so much of what he says about the feminists, about women and so on, and it might be that the feminist's will is the will to truth, or that in seeking independence, quote Nietzsche, beyond good and evil, she begins to enlighten men about woman as she is. One could make that critique of feminism, and of course Nietzsche does, and you could make a criticism of feminism as governmental or legalistic or triumphalist, as other Nietzschean feminists have, or feminists responding to Nietzsche. They're all good criticisms. But those particular criticisms aren't particularly applicable to Irigaray, so there's nothing about what Nietzsche said about feminism that will particularly capture Irigaray. I'm thinking then of another kind of encounter between them, beyond the direct response that is made by Nietzsche to the feminist, or the direct response that's made by Irigaray to Nietzsche, or the indirect response that's made by Irigaray to Nietzsche. For Irigaray, the concept of life, with which Nietzsche would criticise the feminist as bad for life, is itself an appropriation of life, as indicated by those metaphors of pregnancy and procreation used to evoke the latter, the former, indications for Irigaray of denied debt to procreation. What Irigaray can introduce into Nietzsche's work then is a field of possible sexual difference that his work averts, she argues. But is there then a return, a possibility for reading her work creatively for what it averts? So I could stop with just that question. I'd be making the case that it's the right one for Irigaray. It's a good way of reading, and it's not the one that I think her work best tolerates. That's to say, the question would be, what's averted in her own reading of Nietzsche? What's the question that she doesn't want to ask of Nietzsche? And what's the question she doesn't want to ask about the stance of critique that she takes to him, which I'm suggesting could be thought of as a genealogical question? I think that's a good question for her. From my own perspective, that means that Irigaray and Nietzsche don't quite change each other. But for me, that's to consider what both very interestingly say about sexual difference and its limits and its role as indicative of the limits of the philosophers, to think about degrees of proximity that are formed between them, at least in this respect, and then to switch our understanding of the terrain, to suggest that perhaps a dialogue about sexual difference can also be seen, as I'm suggesting, just to start things off, as a dialogue between technicians of critique. How do we engage critique? What's the right question to ask of critique and with critique? That's because when these two technicians confront each other head-on, I think that something stops short. And interested in the capacities of philosophical frameworks, sometimes the ones that aren't entirely pursued, or the reserves that are held over in philosophical frameworks and in stances of critique. Because of that, I'd like to imagine how this dialogue between them could continue a little further. And that means that I approach Marine Lover with a different kind of question. As I read them, I think that Irigaray and Nietzsche don't quite manage to exhaust each other's limits. So Irigaray to Nietzsche, she'll use a language of appropriation, of debt, of the promise and of ethics. And he's got some very good questions to ask about genealogies of debt, morality, promising, forgetting, ethics, those particular questions don't need to be the questions that Irigaray follows in their form. That's to say, it's not that the answers that Nietzsche will give to a genealogy of ethics promising debt, it's not that that particular genealogy needs to be Irigaray's, but the question that will be directed to those forms, what is the genealogy of them, that's a good question for Irigaray. So I'm suggesting a way that Nietzsche can push back against her, at least in the question of genealogy of modes of critique, of what we become, what kind of forms we adopt in engaging in critique. And insofar as I'm doing that, I'm imagining a different kind of between of Irigaray and Nietzsche, not just what Nietzsche says of the feminist, not just what Irigaray says of Nietzsche, not just how Irigaray indirectly responds to Nietzsche, not just that indirect trajectory she takes of reconstructing the watery regions, but also the thing that doesn't pass between them, but that could, as capacity, and its capacity of questions that could be further directed between them, a different kind of between. And that would be for Irigaray to tolerate a kind of a pushback of Nietzsche of another kind. So that's to start, and then that would be to then allow some transition to a more recent Irigarayan response to Nietzsche.
I'd like to start by thanking Bernard and Jesus and also Anna. It's an honor to be here, and I have to say with some trepidation, I'm excited to revisit two of my old flames, Irigaray and Friedrich Nietzsche. So I've entitled my engagement this evening, Reading Nietzsche with Irigaray, Not Your Garden Variety Philosophy. And I'd like to begin with an epigraph from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Quote, "To be sure, I am a forest and a night of dark trees, but he who is not afraid of my darkness will find banks full of roses under my cypresses." I first encountered Irigaray's work in the mid-1980s when I was writing my dissertation on Nietzsche at Northwestern. Up to the mid-70s, feminism was dominated by second-wave notions of equality, and philosophy still only reluctantly considered Simone de Beauvoir among its ranks, in spite of her own protestations to the contrary. Feminist philosophy was primarily aimed at criticizing masculinist ideas throughout the history of philosophy. While Irigaray's early work engaged the history of philosophy, in addition to criticizing male-dominated philosophy on its own terms, she talked back, employing double mimesis, through which she would take up the position of the feminine allotted to women in the texts of Plato, Nietzsche, Freud, Lacan, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Heidegger, and others, by repeating their words back to them in the context of her own parodic and lyrical discourse. By doing so, she challenged the limited position assigned to women as mere reflection of man and attempted to open up a space for another voice. At that time, over 30 years ago, I'd never seen anything like it. So irreverent, clever, and passionate, and at times wickedly funny. Well, lately, Irigaray has turned away from that early mimetic style in favor of a more, we might call, direct approach. Throughout her writings, she has been and continues to be concerned with developing an elemental philosophy born from earth, air, fire, and water that includes all living beings embedded in their environments and the dense web of relationships that sustain them, particularly relations with vegetal life. In her first book from 1974, Speculum of the Other Woman, She railed against Plato and Freud for privileging vision over touch and disavowing sensuousness of our embodied and sexuate experience. That book, which was her thesis at École Freudienne, got her expelled, and she lost her teaching post at the University of Vincennes. She says that she wrote that book not in a library or at a desk, but in the woods or by the sea. In subsequent work, she criticized Heidegger for forgetting the density of air, so essential for life, in favor of his clearing, devoid of life. And in Amant Marine, she challenged Nietzsche for forgetting the maternal waters out of which all humans are born, in favor of great heights and the rarefied air of mountaintops. That was 1980. The following year, she published Elemental Passions, an ode to the elements that sustain us and through which we encounter each other as sexuate beings. And in her latest work, Through Vegetal Being, published last year, and A New Culture of Energy, forthcoming this year from Columbia, she continues to insist that Western philosophy and Western thought in general has not come to terms with what it means to be sexuate beings living together on Earth. In her search for philosophical companionship on her journey toward a new humanity that embraces sexuate being beyond sex or reproduction and towards love and the exchange of energy, she suggests that Nietzsche is the most receptive philosopher to accompany her on her path in this latest work, Through Vegetal Being. Still lamenting what she calls his mistake of preferring mountains and ice over trees and forests, but setting him apart from the rest of the history of philosophy, she says in Through Vegetal Being, quote, "As for Nietzsche, he takes a great interest in feminine figures and characters, especially as representing life. He criticizes their failings with fierceness and affirms that only maternity can correct them. Nevertheless, he acknowledges that he needed a feminine companion in order to be able to pursue his work. I am afraid that the philosophers who follow Nietzsche have not perceived the seriousness of his quest for a feminine companion. Nothing thus in the work of these philosophers answers the tragic appeal of Nietzsche to a feminine companion in order to become capable of crossing the bridge toward a new humanity." End quote. Perhaps this is why, written 37 years ago, Luce Irigaray's Amant Marine remains one of her most amorous works, which she describes in an interview, quote, as not a book on Nietzsche, but with Nietzsche, who is for me a partner in love. The first section of Amant Marine is written as a kind of final love letter to end a bittersweet affair because the addressee, the male lover, is incapable of marrying. Marrying with an A, marrying with an E, she plays with that, and other. He loves always only himself. The feminine and the woman that he embraces so tightly that he becomes confused about his own identity, is just a projection of himself. Nietzsche and his characters, Dionysus, Apollo, Christ, and Zarathustra, all appropriate women, she argues, the feminine and especially the maternal. Irigaray suggests then that man forgets his maternal origin, invents instead a masculine birth, usurps maternal creative powers, and embraces only the eternal return of the same, namely himself, in what she calls elsewhere a homosexual, that is with two M's as in a homosexual economy of the same. And I think Penny has challenged her interpretation of the eternal return, and in other places I would also challenge that, but that's her argument. When Nietzsche finally mentions Nietzsche by name, this is also interesting, finally in the penultimate section of Marine Lover, she suggests that his reenactment, or his parody, as she calls it, of the Christian Advent can result in his desired revaluation of values, quote, only if he goes beyond the father-son relationship, if he announces beyond Christianity that only through difference can the incarnation unfold without murderous or suicidal passion. Rhythm and measure of a female other, she continues, that endlessly undoes the autological circle of discourse, thwarts the eternal return of the same, opens up every horizon through the affirmation of another point of view whose fulfillment can never be predicted. End quote. Following Nietzsche, yet going beyond, Irigaray argues that Christians have forgotten the most important part of Christ's message, namely incarnation, and that Christ did not heal with words, but rather with touch and love. Irigaray describes earth as the forgotten maternal soil that nourishes man, even as Christianity turns her into a tomb out of which man rises to return to his Father. Driven out of the garden that is the abundance of earth's flora and fauna, Christianity turns earth into, quote, a great deportation camp where men await celestial redemption. And rather than go towards, quote, the depths of the earth, they go, quote, toward the abysses of heaven, and not through or for the mother's passion, but by identification with the Father's word. If then, as Nietzsche's Zarathustra proclaims, the Übermensch is, quote, the meaning of the earth, Irigaray's marine lover suggests that he too has turned the earth and the sea into a tomb and mined its depths only to soar above it and leave it behind. She asks, quote, is the reign of the Superman at hand when the whole earth becomes sublime discourse, when all that remains of her is her praise in the memory of ghosts? End quote. Sailing on the sea but never exploring its depths, flying above the surface of the earth but never exploring beneath its crust, this is how Irigaray describes a masculinist philosophy that substitutes words for bodies and forgets incarnation. She takes Nietzsche to task for staying on the surface of both the sea and the earth and never going deeper. She says, quote, deeper than the solid crust, you must now descend to announce the meaning of the earth. A solid plain is never just a solid plain. It rests on subterranean and submarine life, on capped fires and winds which yet stir ceaselessly beneath that shell. End quote. We might say that the juxtaposition between solid crust and the subterranean or submarine points to a difference in the way Nietzsche has been taken up by contemporary French philosophy. Namely, the difference between privileging metaphors of surface or metaphors of depth. Arguably, Deleuze and Foucault, for example, are attracted to metaphors of surface, folds, stretched membranes, plateaus, and rhizomes, emphasizing what we might call external or horizontal growth and mechanical repetition, whereas Kristeva, Irigaray, and to some extent Derrida prefer fleshier or juicier metaphors. For example, Kristeva's psychic space, Irigaray's continuous use of the metaphor of sap, which you see in Amat Marine all the way through her most contemporary work, and also Irigaray and Derrida repeated mentions of blood and other bodily fluids metabolizing, or even internal processes such as Derrida's autoimmunity, emphasizing what we might call internal or vertical growth and biological repetition. Although to be sure, Derrida and Irigaray insist on the essential relationality rather than mere intersections or flipped sides between the horizontal and the vertical, surface and depth, external and internal processes. But that's another story. Just want to suggest this possibility of the surface and depth in coming out of French readings of Nietzsche, and place Irigaray on this depth side, whereas others folks you've been talking about on the surface side. which I think is interesting. Related to this question of surface and depth, in her early work, Irigaray developed the notion of the sensible transcendental to point to the way in which fleshy existence not only goes beneath or below the surface, but also beyond it via encounters, or what she calls the interval between living beings. In her most recent work, breathing is another essential connection between surface and depth, between inside and outside, that not only signals our dependence on our environment, particularly air, but also our independence, since, as she repeatedly points out, we take our first breath on our own only after we come into the world out of our mother's bodies. Indeed, speaking of breath in through vegetal being, Irigaray says, quote, "Only some yogis and the man of the mountains that Nietzsche was still remember smelling as a path for spiritual becoming. Now our nose is certainly the privileged sense to pass, above all through breathing, from a natural to a spiritual life." End quote. And this passage from natural to spiritual, so necessary for humanity's future, depends upon diving into the depths of the soil and the sea. In this regard, Irigaray's elemental philosophy and her engagement with Nietzsche's various animals, plants, and the earth prefigure and anticipate, I think, some of the most exciting recent Nietzsche scholarship in English. For example, Vanessa Lem's work on Nietzsche's animal philosophy, but I think even more exciting, her recent articles on Nietzsche and plants, Gary Shapiro's new book, Nietzsche's Earth, along with remarks in Michael Marder's Plant Thinking, and of course, through Vegetal Being, Michael Marder's dialogue with Irigaray. Citing Nietzsche's frequent mentions of plants and cultivation, for example, Vanessa Lem argues, quote, "From the perspective of the totality of life, human value creation is continuous with value creation in animals and plants." I think she revises this slightly in some more recent article that's forthcoming, but in this idea of a continuity. As Nietzsche says in Human All Too Human, quote, "To live means to judge, measure, and evaluate, such that human value grows out of," quoting Nietzsche, "moral character of plants and animals, and from whom there's much we can learn," I think he suggests. Gary Shapiro calls Nietzsche's a garden philosophy, quoting aphorisms such as "gardener and garden," "Woe to the thinker who is not the gardener, but only the soil of the plants that grow in him," from Dawn. And "Don't forget the garden, and have people who are around you as a garden, or as music on the waters in the evening when the day is turned to memories," from Beyond Good and Evil. Or Zarathustra's Garden Happiness, and again from Human All Too Human, the section entitled Vegetation of Happiness, that describes, quote, "little gardens of happiness sprouting in the volcanic ground of suffering that makes up life." Finally, speaking of the surface and the depth of the earth as what we could call a body with organs, Zarathustra says that although humans constitute a disease on the skin or surface of the earth, quote, "the heart of the earth is of gold." Shapiro reads Nietzsche's notion of Menschen Erde, human earth, as an anti-teleological, anti-theological, quote from Shapiro, "translation of the recently named geological era of the Anthropocene, during which the earth begins to undergo transformation through human activity." He reads Nietzsche's directive to be loyal to the earth as a call for vigilance toward the terrible power of human engagement. I would say, in addition, we could interpret this call for a new type of responsibility, beyond good and evil, beyond praise and blame, and beyond traditional humanist philosophies. Nietzsche suggests that we must cultivate ourselves as plants in nourishing soil and become our own gardeners to grow into a new form of humanity, more like plants, in tune with our environment. Following Nietzsche, Irigaray's writings are not only full of plant metaphors, but also recently proposed that human beings can learn from dwelling with plants. And here I think this is similar to Nietzsche, but also different from this dwelling with plants. It's not becoming plant, but dwelling with plants. Not to say I am the forest, but I am encountering the forest or with the forest, particularly by dwelling with trees in forests. She continually brings us back to the trees and the forests in her latest work and suggests, I think, that we learn ethical lessons needed to nourish a new humanity based on love rather than hate, on sharing rather than hoarding or dominating. We learn these lessons from plants. It's important to note, however, that both Nietzsche and Irigaray envision a unique place for a new humanity, not merely as human animals or human plants in the continuum of life. So maybe contra Lem's argument, I would say, but also as responsible gardeners tending the garden that is our destiny, along with the garden earth and its related fate. In her latest published work, Irigaray maintains that the energy of human sexual desire is neither vegetal sap nor animal instinct, and neither is it aimed at the good nor designed for possessing objects, but rather, quote, human desire has other possibilities that we must realize in order to accomplish our human destiny. She continues, quote, we are working for us becoming ourselves, following the Nietzschean teaching, become who you are, end quote. And for her, I think, as Penny was suggesting, it's about this relationship, which it may not be. I mean, life for Nietzsche and Irigaray, as Penny was suggesting, may have very different ideas of life. Reminiscent of Nietzsche, too, in this latest work, Irigaray describes herself coming out of the garden or woods, or coming down from the mountain, even, in search of human companionship essential to our uniquely human life. She says, quote, for various reasons, the state of bliss that I experienced in the garden or in the woods, not to yet tell of the mountains, could not last. The dusk will arrive at sundown. Perhaps a shower of rain will force me to seek shelter. And obviously, we are not always at the beginning of spring or the heart of summer. Fortunately, the desire for a human companion helped me to endure mourning for the impossible permanence of bliss in nature, end quote. Sounds very Nietzschean, very resonant with Nietzsche's Zarathustra. She goes on to describe the task of bringing the bliss of nature back into human relations through our sexual desire, which is always beyond mere sexual relations and is our way of being in the world. And here, as Penny argues so compellingly in her essay, Animality and Descent, is where Irigaray parts company with Nietzsche. Cultivating this desire, Irigaray says, quote, asks us to remain two, which requires us to use and develop our natural forms in a human way. Such an evolution necessitates our respect for the elements composing the macrocosm and their appropriation to the microcosm that we are, end quote. To remain two, not I am the forest. I am in the forest or with the forest. She's clear that by appropriation she does not mean assimilation or possession, but rather, quote, a transfiguration of our physical nature into our relational, sexuate way of being. Sexuate desire, fertilized, as she says, by the elements, is, quote, awakened by another, especially another human being, but not exclusively other humans. Indeed, awakening to the possibility of this awakening of desire in relation to other living beings is necessary for what she imagines as a transfiguration of human being into beings who not only acknowledge their sexuate way of being in the world and on the earth, but also learn to love the earth and other earthlings through that sexuate energy. Returning to Irigaray's engagement with Nietzsche, after so many years away, for myself, I see the seeds of my own recent book, Earth and World. There, engaging with Kant, Arendt, Heidegger, and Derrida, I tried to develop an ethics of Earth grounded on the affirmation of bio and social diversity that make the Earth a living planet. This Earth ethics emerges from the tension between the absolutely unique place of each one and the collectively shared bond to the Earth, both of which necessarily constitute the life of the planet. It's not just that we share physical space or proximity on the surface of the Earth, but more significantly, we share a special bond to the Earth as our home, whether home or habitat, and our only home. This singular bond of all living beings to the Earth and to other earthlings directly and indirectly obligates us to the sustaining possibility by virtue of which we not only exist and survive, but also live and thrive. All earthlings belong to Earth, and Earth belongs to us. If we see belonging not in terms of property, but in terms of the longing and companionship, the companionship of its archaic meanings, then our belonging to the Earth is born from our singular bond to the Earth. Belonging as longing for companionship. Eros as the drive towards home that is grounded on love of the Earth. In terms of Earth ethics, this belonging requires an affirmation of the sort St. Augustine names when he says, "I want you to be," which I think Irigaray would endorse, perhaps as an alternative to Nietzsche's "I am you," or "I am the forest, I am the feminine." As Irigaray's engagement with Nietzsche reminds us, elemental ethics begins in cohabitation, become companionship, and affirmation become love, and not with a system of moral rules or universal principles that we can know through reason or calculation. In Marine Lover, even 30 years ago, calculation is associated with the phallocentric obsession with size, bigger or smaller, or quantity that positions woman as castrated. Recently, in Through Vegetal Being, she concludes, quote, "Computational thinking no longer has anything to teach us, while the life and surviving of trees do. Namely, quote, to build a human relational world capable of ensuring the coexistence between us without any domination or exclusion of other living beings," end quote. Earth ethics, then, might be responsiveness to others and the environment by virtue of which we not only survive but also thrive. This responsiveness is based on our earthly existence as embodied creatures sharing a planet, even when we do not share a world. Rooted in the Earth's unearthly strangeness, we can never know or master. Earth ethics necessarily takes us beyond calculation, beyond recognition, beyond assimilation or destruction of the other, and towards responsive dwelling by acknowledging our cohabitation and interdependence in order to become earthly companions. The meaning of the Earth as the responsibility of loving companionship.
I want to offer you the floor. I do have questions. And Bernard, because you both have probably questions.
Okay. All right. So I think maybe both Patricia and I will try to motivate some of the discussion, and then we'll open it up, right? So I was, first of all, thank you very much for both presentations. I thought it might be useful to put Irigaray's text a little bit in conversation with the seminar as it's been going on over the course of the past few sessions, because I think that opens up some questions related to your presentations. And what we've been encountering with recent authors that we've been coming across, in contrast to the first authors, Heidegger, Bataille, who were, it seems, trying to recuperate a Nietzsche from the hands of people who they felt had distorted the readings. But more recently, we've come across authors, critics, who are engaging some of the more difficult dimensions of Nietzsche, and are doing so in different ways. So, and I was thinking here first of Sarah Kaufman, and particularly Sarah Kaufman's book on the question of anti-Semitism, which we were in part discussing in January. Because there too, Sarah Kaufman is kind of taking on this aspect of Nietzsche's writings that has proven to be extremely difficult to address. Fanon is the other one who was reacting to the more imperial dimensions of Nietzsche, and then Irigaray, who is here dealing with the dimension of woman in Nietzsche. And they do it in very different ways. Sarah Kaufman, in her book Le mépris des Juifs, Nietzsche, les Juifs, l'antisémitisme, basically directly addresses the passages where Nietzsche speaks about Jews and directly addresses those passages that that are the most difficult to read, and ultimately writes a defense of Nietzsche on this question. And of course, the circumstances of her writing were different than the circumstances of Irigaray, in the sense that she was a Nietzsche scholar. I mean, she was much more of a dedicated Nietzsche scholar, and much more dedicated to the task of an exegesis of Nietzsche, right? So the circumstances were somewhat different, whereas, of course, Luce Irigaray could not be identified as a dedicated Nietzsche scholar. But Kaufman's approach was to take on directly the passages and then to analyze them in such a way, actually, as to try and show there that Nietzsche's claimed anti-Semitism is not, in fact, anti-Semitic. So the approach there is to perform a form of a defense with a direct engagement of the particular passages, and then to recuperate Nietzsche in the process. Fanon takes, I think, a very different approach, which, as we had discussed when we were discussing Fanon, there's a trajectory to his relationship to Nietzsche, one in which he starts in Black Skin, White Masks by being heavily influenced, relying on Nietzsche as well as Marx and Freud, using particular ideas and relying on them, and then eventually moving away, right? And moving away from Nietzsche and also from European thought, arguing that that's just not going to be a model for the man of the future, for what he's trying to develop. And so you see there, ultimately, a complete rejection, such that by the end of it, you don't hear about Nietzsche anymore. He's not present really in The Wretched of the Earth and in important passages where he might have appeared before. So Luce Irigaray, who's then taking on the question of women in Marine Lover especially, does something very different, it seems to me. Not taking on or addressing specifically the passages, but using Nietzsche as a constant foil, and here obviously an explicit foil, to develop her own philosophy, which, as you both showed, is an extremely productive move. Penelope, you showed us, I think, how she most productively kind of appropriates from Nietzsche these ways of speaking and these ideas and themes of the debt and the forgiving and the silence of the others and the forms of creativity, but that in the process of kind of taking on those terms critically and critiquing Nietzsche, there's a question, or the question that arises is, what are the limits of such a critique of critique, I take it, right? I suppose it's a question of the productivity of that move, right? Which then raises maybe the central issue, which also I think Kelly Oliver's presentation raises, which is, would it have been better not to use Nietzsche as a foil? Would it have been possible? I think the answer has to be yes, of course. But would it have been better? Would it have been more productive? Would it have allowed for a different presentation? Kelly Oliver, by focusing on the later Irigaray, particularly vegetal being, it almost feels as if the later Irigaray is less of a has less of the critique of Nietzsche on woman and more of a use of some of the appropriations or use of the ideas as a way for her to independently develop her philosophical views and insights. Views that end up sounding or presenting a particular Nietzsche that I think is somewhat consonant with the Nietzsche that Rudiger Bittner presents in his work, although I'm not sure, because on our way here I wasn't sure, so you'll have to fill us in on that. But I do think that the view of Nietzsche that Rudiger Bittner spells out in his introduction to the Cambridge edition of the Nachlass on the late notebooks, and also in his essay A Horse in the Basement, Nietzschean Reflections on Political Philosophy, that there's a particular vision of Nietzsche that would be somewhat sympathetic to this reading because it has a kind of a historical dimension that would allow us to think more positively about the place of nature, maybe in less of a biological way, but the place of nature or of maybe not love, but something about human harmony, I think, possibly. Now, but all of this raises the question, I think, in the two presentations of, I think, the core question of whether it makes sense to be engaged with Nietzsche at all, maybe. And so whether Fanon's approach might have been better to kind of dispense with him, but maybe then to use him, or to not to use him, but to quietly appropriate the direction of his thought, maybe. And in part it's because there are many passages in here where one, I think, in the Marine Lover, where the feeling of some feeling of bitterness or something is so strong that I don't know, it kind of, I don't know, it sometimes it feels as if the bitterness, those elements of bitterness are so strong that it hinders the Irigay's own vision and philosophical intervention. So I think those are some of the questions that I have in terms of your presentations and the reading. Patricia, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah. You'll have to forgive me for very spontaneous questions, since I didn't know I was going to ask questions until about 10 minutes before I got here. So anyhow, I once attended Irigaray's seminar in Paris in the late 80s, and I just want to give you a little anecdote. I remember she asked all of us to write down a dialogue between a man and a woman. And then she said, you know, how many of you, she was looking at, anyhow, have had the women ask the questions and the men give the answers. Anyhow, this is just a little thing, thinking about questions, forms of critique, and that. And I'm really struck, and I'm just going to proceed by a series of motifs and things that have struck me, about a tension between Irigaray's responsiveness, you could say, and a kind of responsiveness that allows for fluidity and a kind of a circulation in various economies that isn't fixed. And then the tension with, you could say, a more fixed prescriptive position. And I noticed this in the difference between both of your responses to Irigaray and in the forms of your critique, how this very much was a very, very different way of responding to and interlocuting with her. And it made me think about a number of things. Penny, I saw you, and looking at your book on Irigaray, you ask what modes of, in the very end, you ask what modes of indigenous identity are excluded by the available options of sameness versus difference, and you're thinking about how can we push Irigaray kind of about thinking about class, race, cultural, social difference, and thinking also, you know, with all the critique of Western philosophy, what about, you know, post-colonial difference? How would Irigaray engage potentially with those modes of critique? And you say, if you don't mind me reading a section of Dissent, is that okay? All right, thank you. Sorry. You say, how have we always not been thinking of cultural difference? An Irigarayan approach would propose a genealogy not just of what has been said about race and cultural difference throughout the history of philosophy, but of what that history has not wanted to say about race and cultural difference. Such a genealogy would ask what notions of difference have been possible, both racist and egalitarian, in the history of philosophy, and also what notions of difference have not been possible. Such a project will not follow exactly the same pattern as Irigaray's analysis of the impossibility of sexual difference, but a genealogy of the unsaid about race and cultural difference in philosophers, from Plato to Merleau-Ponty and Levinas and later, about the stranger and the racially different other, is no less timely than Irigaray's work on sexual difference, and I take it to be the unsaid of her work. So I'm very struck with how, Penny, you're working in a kind of poetics, and almost not necessarily poetics in the strict sense of the term, but looking for the unsaid or the unthought, not necessarily unthought, but the unspoken, and working, you could say, with Nietzsche in a kind of Nietzschean sense, not necessarily towards what's stated, but towards what is gestured to or potentially generative of her thought. And in that sense, there's a kind of a Nietzschean engagement with her that's, that expands and generates beyond, you could say, her oeuvre and overflows, you could say, in that way. And this kind of allows for an Irigaray that in some ways is very elastic. We can speculate along with Irigaray, although this question still remains, and I'm not sure. My question would be like, how much do you think where is that question, and how much would you engage with the unsaid in these areas too now with Irigaray? Then moving towards this other kind of a Nietzsche that we could say that I see in Kelly Oliver in your reading of Irigaray, there's a much more engaging with what's said, with a prescriptive, you could say, capacity in Irigaray. And I feel there's something about Irigaray as almost a Zarathustra in her, I mean, forgive me, but it is a kind of enthusiasm and a prescriptive capacity that is, doesn't have the same kind of irony or rhetorical possibilities as, as the other version. But especially, I feel a little more anxious about the prescriptive Irigaray. And I think it's an anxiety I felt too in the same writing down that conversation and feeling bad for whatever I wrote in the question and everything. And so let me free associate a little bit more. But I felt potentially as though we come back to the language of obligation and debt, and a language of obligation and debt this time towards the earth, which, I mean, I'm all for in certain ways, but it's the prescriptive nature of that debt and obligation that I find I'm not comfortable with. And I find a strangely Christian resonance with it. An oddly Christian, I'm just suddenly thought of St. Francis and, and a kind of displacement of the maternal body, you could say, onto the earth, but that also had a strongly moralizing or, ethically prescriptive tone to it, that perhaps loving allows for alterity, but I thought, but what about violence? What about the violence of desire and the violence that comes, that she can't just be, is she just becoming a Hegelian in some ways? Is there a kind of way in which she's going back to kind of, I don't know, a kind of determinate negation? And I'm not so sure. So I see your, Penny, kind of on this side of the non-Hegelian, the interruptive Irigaray. And Kelly, I'm wondering where you would see that. I mean, I'm again going back to the responsive and potentially reactive tendencies. So anyhow, and also the becoming who you are is also, that's Bonaventure. That's that's kind of a profoundly medieval and Christian overtone and intonation that I feel like when Nietzsche's speaking it, there's always that irony that is the the restlessness. Yeah, and here I just suddenly feel anxious. There you go.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Do you want to address some of those questions?
Gladly. Yes, so this is a very helpful moment just to think again about the flexibility that I always really appreciated in the gesture she brought to the history of philosophy, and that the flexibility was, you know, again, to go back to the theme I was introducing, a flexibility of critique. So, you know, you might just have the habit of feminist critique of assuming that your problem was what is said about women, and it's helpful if that's your habit to be reminded by Irigaray's early work that in fact you could respond to the history of philosophy quite differently. You could simply approach it from the question of what is not said about women, and you could really build up quite a lot creatively. But to do that, you know, you really need someone to sort of push you out of the tracks of what you'd suppose. And I suppose I see that pushing out of the tracks again in the response to Nietzsche. That, you know, that the most important thing really about her response to Nietzsche is not what is said about women. So that's just to sort of come back to, you know, Tricia's very kind reminding of the you know, the response I'd made to Irigaray some time ago, where I was thinking, okay, well, let's say you start with that as your project. Well, then there's some questions arise. I mean, most obviously, sort of formulaically, if you're interested in what is not said, if that seems to you a way of changing, say, habits of feminist theory, then what is it that you yourself don't want to say? You know, what are the limits of that critique in your own work? And I didn't take that to be hostile critique of Irigaray. I took that to be pushing the edges of the flexibility that she was inviting. You know, I mean, it's cheap perhaps to say, well, then what is the limits of her own analysis? Will she extend the thinking of sexual difference to say problems of race difference? But not only cheap in that it is to respond to the way she's wanting to work by reiterating that we can attend and think about what is not articulated, and there's no doubt that there's a condition of the way that she's working on sexual difference which sets the limit at extending to race the same kind of analysis. So I guess I did have that kind of response in mind when I was thinking about the response to Nietzsche, because again, you know, she just to repeat it, you know, she's really reminding us that the problem that we bring to Nietzsche is not necessarily the content, it's not necessarily what's said. But then I guess if I was thinking about the limits of her work again, which I think is an interesting thing to do with a philosopher who's interested so much in limits. You know, she works so much with limits, so it just seems to be not inappropriate to take up that work from the position of her limit. That seems to be not hostile or antagonistic, but continuous and right. And you know, if we're thinking about the limits of her response to Nietzsche, then I think that we can use that to rethink again the conduct of critique. You know, because to come back to, you know, Bernard's responses, there's so much about the response that she makes where you can challenge her on content and think again about gesture. So let's say that you're picking up on a bitterness in tone, and let's say she's responding to Nietzsche. Well, in a sense, what she could be doing, let me not say should be doing, but could be doing, is to be thinking, okay, if there's bitterness in tone, what is the gesture of bitterness? That's not just about responding to what Nietzsche says, it's also about responding to what Nietzsche has to say about the problem of the bitter. But again, that would be to jostle her critical gesture. It would be to use her response to Nietzsche to then push out into another place, and that other place would be that she's not responding just to what he has to say, but also to the actual gestures of critique that he offers. But that's something that I was saying, does not want to do. So that the Nietzsche that she wants to respond to is the Nietzsche of content, you know, content about origins or water or creativity or procreation or women. But it's not a gesture it's not a Nietzsche who is interested in the gestures of critique. There's a Nietzsche that she just doesn't want to respond to, and it's the person who can turn up and say, well, what is the mode of critique that is bitter? And if you were Irigaray responding to Nietzsche, then maybe what you can also do is respond to the gesture of bitterness. So that's another way of responding to a figure. So if you're asking me if I think that, or ask if we see value in reading Nietzsche, well, I guess the question tonight arises, you know, with Irigaray, like, do we see value in reading Irigaray with Nietzsche? And I really do, because I go on seeing her that prompting of a questioning of the obvious conduct of critique, that, for me it's very, very helpful to see how the one thing that Nietzsche most obviously offers her, which is the capacity to say, okay, what are the conditions of possibility of thinking debt? What are the conditions of possibility of thinking the emergence of the moral? What is it to adopt the gesture of bitterness? Those are the kinds of responses he can make, but she doesn't want those kinds of questions. She's not, to put it in a simple way, she's not self-critical in that sense. So I find it very useful, just in terms of intuitions of critique, to see the moves that would be obvious, the ones that she attempts to make in counterintuitive ways, and then the ways that the other kinds of moves that are entirely blocked out, even as she attempts to do that. And I guess I go on thinking that that kind of practice of critique, to be working in that way, is an incredibly useful thing to do. To speak to the Foucauldian anew, that to think about the formations that are most intuitive, and to try to slightly to think sideways and to think otherwise. It's not that easy, and I find her a very, very good resource in that way. But at least for me, to do that is to think not only with what she does say, but also what she doesn't say. Not just about race, but also in the gestures, in the critical gestures. And I have to say I really like the engagement with Nietzsche for exactly that reason, because I think it offers so much reflection on what it is really to respond to a philosopher, not just to their content, but to their gestures. Partly in the way she does do it, but also in the way she doesn't do it. And I like that as a way of going on thinking about responses to lots of philosophers. Yeah.
Well, thank you both for those questions, very provocative questions. I think that in thinking about the relationship between Irigaray and Nietzsche, one of the fascinating elements is Nietzsche's own embrace of multiplicity. And in some sense, and I think that this has been contested in the feminist literature and readings of Irigaray, whether Irigaray also embraces multiplicity or not. And I mean, this is where, some of the questions that Penny was raising, and then Patricia in her questions of Penny talking about race as the unsaid of Irigaray's work, and whether Irigaray's work could apply to race. I think that might be a limit insofar as there are many places, and here again it's open for interpretation, because there are also other suggestions in Irigaray, but there are many places wherein she insists on this too. One way to interpret it is that we are dealing with the problem, the ancient problem of the one and the many, and we can't get to the many or multiplicity until we can think two. So until we can think two, we can't think 3, 4, 5, and multiplicity. That would be one way of reading Irigaray. But another way of reading Irigaray, I think, is to read her insistence on the two, and the problem of sexual difference, as she says in an Ethics of Sexual Difference, is the problem of our age. I mean, she cites Heidegger, saying that Heidegger suggests that every age or every epoch has its problem. It has its, and for Heidegger, that was the question of being. For us, Irigaray thinks it's the question of sexual difference. This is the unthought in our relationship to ourselves, sexual difference. And for her, she, in many passages, will insist on this too, and lots of people have challenged her. This is heteronormative, and to say that there are only two sexes. But she is insistent in so many places on our inability to think sexual difference that, another way to read, I think, what she's doing is that we can't think multiple sexes until we can think two, and we can't even think two. We still can't think two. And to think multiplicity the way that we have been thinking multiplicity, or the way that Nietzsche also thinks multiplicity, and I think this is suggested, Penny, in your article, to think multiplicity is to just fall back into this inability to think the two. It's a way of avoiding sexual difference, or a way of avoiding two. Now, this has a lot of problems. And one of my, to go back to some of Patricia's anxieties about my presentation, I think that your anxieties, Patricia, I think might be also anxieties that I share or shared about going back to Irigaray. Because even even as I said, my first reaction when this text came out 37 years ago was a very ambivalent reaction to this reading of Nietzsche. I mean, for one thing, at that time I was a Nietzsche scholar, I guess. This is another lifetime. It was another. I mean, it really. I mean, literally, for some of you in the room, you were not alive. So it was for me, another lifetime ago when I was engaging with this text. So to be asked to go back there was also very difficult. It's very difficult. How do I go back to a place where I felt uncomfortable already 30 years ago, and feeling now this kind of double anxiety, really, about going back to a place that already was a kind of uncomfortable place, which was this engagement with Irigaray. So on the one hand, as you were pointing out, Bernard, this bitterness in the text is so strong that I think a transformation of a question that Penny began with, is history good for life? This Nietzschean question, we might ask, is history good for feminism? I mean, really asking us to go back to this moment with Irigaray, I think, is asking us to go back to a kind of moment in the history of feminism that we're no longer at. I mean, I think that bitterness maybe has to be read in the context of 30 years ago, a bitterness that I know that my own relationship to was an ambivalent relationship. On the one hand, there was a kind of liberation in the fact that here was this powerful text that talked back. It wasn't, it wasn't your garden variety philosophy. I mean, neither is Nietzsche, right? It's aphorisms and very lyrical and poetic, like the Irigaray, and you can see all of the echoes of and influence of Nietzsche. But there was this bitterness and this edge. And on the one hand, that bitterness and the edge also made me very uncomfortable, especially since I thought in many places she was just wrong about Nietzsche. I thought that what would it be for a Nietzsche? There is no space. I think this is, Penny, what you're suggesting. There is no space for the Nietzsche to talk back and at the limit of this project of Irigaray's. But on the other hand, there was something so powerful about the difference in her approach to these canonical philosophical figures, and it wasn't just Nietzsche, but her engagement. I especially liked her engagement with Lacan, but maybe that's because I wasn't in love with Lacan the way that I was in love with Nietzsche at the time. So it was really funny. So I think it also maybe depends on your relationship, and that's part of her point. Her point is, I'm having a relationship with this figure, so maybe it depends on our relationship or your relationship with the figure. And obviously in this seminar, since Nietzsche has been your main man, that you have a different kind of relationship with him that maybe also I certainly can relate to, where this bitterness is a little jarring. Whereas, for me at least back then, I remember someone like Lacan that I already, had a lot of problems with. I thought it was really funny, her engagement. It made me laugh. It was hilarious. But I guess all of that to say, I think that it's important to contextualize this text. And also I think that this goes back to some of your questions, Bernard, too, about should we read Nietzsche, or maybe not should we read Nietzsche, but should Irigaray have read Nietzsche? I mean, look, she has a project. She's trying to make this argument that sexual difference and the two is missing. This is the unsaid, or something in the history of philosophy. Does she need Nietzsche to do that? Or would she be better off without Nietzsche? Or would we be better off if she hadn't have engaged Nietzsche and made us so upset and anxious by the bitterness of her engagement with Nietzsche? But I think that with, going back to thinking about Fanon's trajectory, you could also make the argument that he had to go through Nietzsche to get to where he ended up. That Irigaray had to go through Nietzsche, that maybe all of us still have to go through Nietzsche, and not just, I mean, certainly in the profound sense of the radicality of Nietzsche's thought, certainly. But also just in the very practical sense of what it means to do what we do as academics, which is to take up a kind of discipleship or tutelage or whatever you want to call it. I mean, we can't just speak in our own voices, you know, that we're not allowed to. I mean, you write a dissertation in your own voice, I don't know where that would, you would get a PhD, and it would be difficult, unless it was some magnificent, you know, I don't know what, it would be, unless you were Nietzsche, right? This is what Nietzsche did, where you would get it published. Nietzsche did that, right? He didn't have to get a PhD, he just wrote, and he, you know, it was so earth-shattering, to use the earth metaphor there. It seems that what Irigaray is doing in that sense of that kind of echoing and mimetic relationship conversation also, I think, could be read as a critical move, and certainly seemed to have been taken as a critical move toward the academy or the institutions that require that we speak always in the voice of another. And certainly when you're starting your career, this is what we all have to do. I mean, if we want to try to develop our own thought, we have to do it through an engagement with a figure that we then are a Nietzsche scholar or a Kant scholar or whatever, Faulkner scholar, whatever. And I think that her methodology in that sense is also radical in the sense that it shows that kind of, that the institutions require this kind of speaking through the voice of another. And maybe I don't know that she's trying to do that. Obviously, it seems that she's trying to show that the feminine has been relegated to that position. But I think, especially given the institutional response to her early work, where she got fired from her job, pretty much said, you know, the institutions aren't going to tolerate this kind of self-reflective, explicit throwing in the face of the institution what the institution requires, which is that you speak through the voice of another. Now, she's doing it in this very intentional way that also is a parody and making fun of that whole process. And then finally, I'm going on too long, so I apologize, but I did want to say that again, in response to some of Patricia's anxiety and questions, what I tried to do for myself, really, and so it was very selfish, but was to approach this project of being here with a kind of generosity toward Irigaray that I wasn't inclined to have in the beginning. You know, with my first response was also like, oh gosh, I don't want to go back there. I mean, it wasn't fun to be there when I was there 30 years ago, and I don't really want to go back there now. So I didn't go back there. I think I tried to have a more generous engagement with Irigaray, and on the one hand. And on the other hand, I don't think that Irigaray's position is Hegelian. I don't think it's a redemption of nature. It's not a redemption of vegetal being. Because for her, we already are of the plant and we are of the animal, but yet we have this kind of responsibility as human, and she's imagining this new kind of humanity. And I think there is a resonance with Nietzsche, imagining this new humanity. And I think there, too, she explicitly, in this latest work, sees her project as continuous with a Nietzschean kind of project. And so I found that also very interesting, that you get a different relationship. If you know, she says, as she said, she had a fling with the philosophers, and reading this Amat Marine as a kind of Dear John letter that she's breaking up. Well, they seem to be getting back together, maybe, in her latest work, because she has a much, I think, more sympathetic and less kind of tongue-in-cheek, less bitter, very different style, obviously, but more appreciation for the importance of Nietzsche to her.
Just a small footnote, which was originally part of or what brought me to the question really was rereading some of the essays in this Sex Which Is Not One, in contrast to reading Marine Lover, or at the same time, right? And thinking about how those work. So from our perspective, since we're here to kind of think of kind of critical engagement with Nietzsche or not, critical engagement with Nietzsche or not, and what it does is to kind of compare those texts a little bit, I think, that are not that different in time, right? All kind of similar period, end of the 70s, and then 1980, and to see how they function and how they work. One that obviously has Nietzsche, well, not in French in the title, right? But
I think it is.
it is?
I think it is. I was wrong.
Amant. Is it Amant de?
De Nietzsche. No.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay.
Yeah,
So, but kind of silent until named later, right? And then these other ones that do without that completely, and how they function. And there was a sense in which I was feeling that they were working for me as a reader better than Marine, right? So that would be one way to kind of explore that question, I think, as well.
Shall we take some comments from Rosalind, for instance? For you.
So I was thinking, listening to you both, I had a question running through my mind about David as a figure and metaphor in this discourse, and about what happens in the progression of the question. Because we've talked about some of the post-Nietzsche work in terms of the moment, particularly the early to the late 70s, when the first Irigaray texts arrived. And I think it's interesting to think of her as one of several anti-dialectical and non-dialectical materials. And particularly given that status of non-dialectical materialism now, ontologies, materialism, and so forth. What that state in the news that Irigaray has made with you, which is, I think, interesting and important. So, Kelly, you began by speaking about speculative as an act of dialectic. It seems to me that very category is thrown into some question in speculum and in this in Amant Marine, which has this epistolary form, and which seems, the epistolary form would seem in some ways to be a restitution of a dialogic form, which was precisely called into question in the citation of a Platonic dialogue, which is not one, in a discourse of identity which is premised upon the effacement of difference. And if you remember the kind of recursive citation that runs like a tick through the latter sections of speculum, hoi anthropoloi sex unspecified, hoi anthropoloi sex unspecified, man sex unspecified, that's the kind of engine of that text. And I think it's possible to interrogate in a very critical way Irigaray's critique of mimetic or representationalist theories of identity and the politics of sexual difference as it was construed in Platonic and other discourse, through recourse to a figure not adequately treated as a figure, and in the resemblance between the womb and the cave is the mechanism for that gesture, which of course comes back in Amant Marine. And many of the passages in speculum are, cited now invisibly in this epistolary form. But those same figures, metaphors, come back, womb as cave, as earth, and so forth. And if the appeal of all those non-dialectical materialists turn to Nietzsche, a form of discourse in which figure was doing a very different work, precisely because the question of figure and metaphor was repressed for him or not on the surface, could use it in a different way. But it does seem to me that one is forced to confront when one wants to sort of summon from either Irigaray or Nietzsche a discourse that seems useful for eco-politics or what have you. It does seem that it behoves us to think the question of metaphor and figure once again. And Nietzsche's significance for non-dialectical materialism seems one of the things that was made visible, actually, by going back to Irigaray in this context, along with Deleuze, Foucault, and others. And I think for the group it's a question, what does non-dialectical materialism appear to offer at this historical juncture in the aftermath of, the kind of radical reorientation of concepts of history and future history and all the rest. But I guess I have, for you all, those questions about what do you think about the question of figure and metaphor, both in terms of the content of the discourse and in terms of the formal work, the Nietzschean work that Irigaray was performing, right from Speculum, even though Nietzsche is not in Speculum, but it's a Nietzschean text in that way, written at a moment when that Nietzscheanism was at least partly expressed in that mode of citation which was not mimetic and which seemed so liberatory then. We've spoken a lot about that, the formal excitement, often at odds with the analytic relationship to the Nietzschean project.
Shall we take some other
questions?
Alex, and then you, and then Beth.
You sure? I don't want to shift too far away from Rosalind's.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. As you were speaking, I was sort of thinking of this particular metaphor that we might take as central to this discussion of the root or the rhizome, insofar as it's the word that Empedocles uses for the element, right? Element is the Latin word. The Greek is stoikeon, but Empedocles doesn't use this. He uses rhizomata, right? So this is something that, in terms of a kind of troping toward origin that both Nietzsche and Irigaray are engaged in together, and this is, I think, probably the core of the polemic, right? The forgetting of the maternal body as an origin as such. And the troping and the metaphorization through origin stories of the gods, right? That both Nietzsche and origin stories of Western philosophy too. Let's not forget in the pre-Socratic. So I just guess I wanted to sort of throw all that out there as a central metaphor at work in these texts that hasn't really come to light at this point, and especially in relation to that really helpful distinction I think you're making, Kelly, between the surface and the depth readers, or uptakers of Nietzsche. Yeah, thanks.
Was your comment also related to the discussion?
I did try to bend it in that direction, but
Why don't? There's some.
No? Okay.
Yeah, I'm tangential too.
All right. Aqua?
Hi. So my question is still about style and about poetics in Irigaray's response to Nietzsche, and thinking about how Nietzsche is effectively pushing us to expand how we think about the rubrics of philosophy and his consistent invocation of poetics. I read Marine Baba in a sense as Irigaray responding to Nietzsche's call for the philosophers of the future, and her showing a different mechanism of philosophizing, because through that poetic style she actually offers critique of things Nietzsche lays out in the birth of tragedy and beyond the hero and so on and so forth. So thinking about the poetics and the opacity as in a certain sense a response to like a call Nietzsche makes beyond the hero. That's my question about your thoughts on that.
So, maybe, do you want to go ahead, or maybe you want to address?
Yeah.
You can address some of these questions, and then we go with the next one.
Before Kelly speaks to new materialism and non-dialectical materialism with authority, I'm teasing. Just to come back to this. You know, for Nietzsche, truth is a form of life. Truth is a conduct. That's something that Nietzsche and Irigaray share at their best. Truth is a way of posting yourself something and finding it with excitement and gratification, for example. That's a conduct. And that would have to be put in the context of what metaphor and metonymy can be. So when Irigaray is responding to Nietzsche, then again I just come back to this question about what can this exchange actually be? You know, what is it that Nietzsche can specifically offer? And what he can offer is an inability, really, for her to see herself as engaging with him and not rethink what truth can be, what truth is. So for me, something gets lost from the possibilities of that exchange when she then responds to Nietzsche again in the later work that Kelly is referring to, where what she takes from Nietzsche is things that they share positively, like a critique of nihilism or an interest in becoming. You know, so all of a sudden this is about positive, positive content that she agrees with them with, as if they have become better friends for that reason. But I think no. I think what she's lost there is that the status of the opposition of truth and metaphor is very, very complex for both her and him, and that means everything for what work she does metaphorically with nature, with woman, with the abyss, with the sea, with the earth, the mountain, and so on. Yeah. It's not oppositional, but it becomes something different if you assume that truth is conduct. Then metaphor becomes, different kinds of conduct. Coins with surfaces. Metaphors become, coins with surfaces rubbed off, and questions of terms that get exchanged and so on. I'm just saying that the way that she can then speak with authority to the status of nature has to be affected by the status of what she thinks truth and truths about nature could be if this is a dialogue with Nietzsche. So I'm just saying that the Nietzschean part will do some displacing work there in the question of metaphor and truth, even when it comes to thinking about the status of nature, the status of the earth, and what earth and nature become for her. I'm not convincing you, am I?
My peculiar interests are not all that relevant to anyone but me, I'm sure.
I guess I'm just saying, excuse me. Yeah.
So, if metaphor is transfer, relentless transfer, and if the argument of speculum was the impossibility of identity, then, is recourse to a notion of conduct, if it's imagined in opposition to metaphor, not simply the restitution of identity in time?
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to oppose metaphor to truth in that sense, but just to say, if we're just bouncing off, if we make this a discussion which just bounces off, what is the exchange? Like, what is the passage of Nietzsche and Irigaray? What do they very specifically capture? It seems to me that the interesting problem of truth being a woman and woman truth, that truth is a conduct, and truth is a conduct where truth becomes the thing that where something's posited behind, that one could find, that one could be revealed, and that one could discover. That problematics is what circulates between them, and that anything that gets then said about nature via anything which captures up distinctions of metaphor, metonymy, truth, figure, image, has got to then become part of that passage. Or else it's another debate between some other people. But if it's a debate between Irigaray and Nietzsche that's kicking this off, I just want to sort of hold in what that circulation is supposed to be doing with truth. And I guess the other thing I was saying was that it seems to me that interest gets lost a little bit from the later work that she offers, or the later responses she makes to Nietzsche. But that's another story again. But if that doesn't do anything for you, then I'm fairly sure that Kelly will absolutely have the alternative. It's very useful having two. It's between two. Much between them.
Right, that interval. But yeah, in fact, the point I wanted to make is that I think that it's happening between more than two. And Emma, I like your point about going back to the Greeks, because for both Nietzsche and Irigaray, this conversation is not, I mean, for Irigaray, the conversation is not just with Nietzsche. And in these other texts too, in the background, there are all kinds of figures, and especially the Greeks when she invokes the elements. And even nature, you know, she's not thinking of the scientific notion of nature or laws of nature or something like that, I don't think. And I think that this also, maybe Rosalind speaks somewhat to your remarks, which were very interesting and very helpful, that this engagement with, Irigaray's engagement with Nietzsche already presupposes this whole conversation with all kinds of other figures, right? We can't just limit this to the dialogue between Nietzsche or between Irigaray and Nietzsche, because there's a whole conversation that's come before them that informs what she's doing with Nietzsche. And then, Aqua, to go back to your comment, that what she's doing with Nietzsche may be something that I do think that you're onto something there, that she feels called upon, as this is an appropriate response to Nietzsche, because she's answering a kind of call to this feminine that then I found, at least in the later remarks about Nietzsche, gave me a kind of softening effect to the bitterness of Amat Marine, and also a way to explain the passion there that you might not see in some of her engagement with the other figures. I mean, you can imagine if you really feel disappointed in someone you love very much, that you're going to have a much stronger reaction than if you feel disappointed in someone, you kind of don't like anyway. You know, it's that kind of passion. And I think there's a lot of the importance of passion, I think, as we still see in the later Irigaray, although her methodology and her style have changed a lot. In terms of the question of metaphor, I mean, one of the things that I was trying to do was, without saying explicitly, was trace these kinds of metaphors in a very loose way because of time constraints and my own time constraints. A very loose way between the metaphorics of Nietzsche's text and the metaphorics of Irigaray's text, from the early text through the late text. Because I think the metaphorics, even though the style has changed, the metaphors that return are metaphors from the early work and from Amat Marine, and metaphors that she also takes from Nietzsche, the plant metaphors, and especially the roots, but also the sap. I mean, there you get the fluidity again, you know, the root versus the sap that flows through the root. And I think that that Rosalind, your point was very important to, I guess, challenge my figuring this as a kind of double mimesis, or a mimesis turned back against itself, is what we could say by this double mimesis. That what Irigaray seems to be doing is something slipperier than the idea of a metaphor as a substitution of one for the other, but more like a metonymy of the slipperiness. But then I think that also, even to say that, also is to acknowledge, again, one of Irigaray's other interlocutors, which is Lacan, but so many others. So I think that what she's staging in this letter, and she's not, you say it's epistolary, but that's a reading, that's the interpretation. I mean, that's something that in my old work I would say, and other people have said, because she doesn't write, "Dear Nietzsche," you know, it is not really, it's not straightforwardly epistolary, but it is definitely a very slippery sort of text that slips between the metaphors, that's really reliant on Nietzsche's own metaphors to work at all, I think. And that's what we hear. That's what we hear, the echoes of Nietzsche, and that's what makes it effective insofar as it is effective, or any of the, especially early texts. But I think those same kind of metaphors are being deployed, and maybe not as an effective way, like you're saying, Penny, or maybe even going back to Patricia's remarks, maybe in a way that fixes instead of really really allows the fluidity. So she's using a more traditional way of talking. But and that also I agree with you, or at least I have an anxiety, especially when she starts talking about yoga and stuff. I'm like, wow, that's weird. So that's in fact why I quit reading Irigaray. But I do think that she, to think about what Nietzsche says about metaphor in an essay like On Truth and Lies that Penny you were alluding to earlier with the coins, truth, just the worn off coin of metaphor. And as you said, also Rosalind asking, well, how can we make this sharp distinction between metaphor and the truth? And I think that that's something that we learn from Nietzsche, that we learn this kind of notion of metaphor that then Irigaray can play with in her text, and then I think we have learned to read, in a sense, from Nietzsche and from his notion of metaphor, to trace these metaphors from one text to another, to kind of follow these metaphors. At least that's what I feel for myself, that I've learned this from Nietzsche. I mean, there's no, and it goes back to Bernard, you're saying, well, can we dispense with Nietzsche? I think we are, we're marinated in Nietzsche. Nietzsche is like the plant, it's become part of us, so that I don't think you can even talk about dispensing with Nietzsche for probably everyone in this room at this point, if you've been reading Nietzsche for for several months. So there's no getting over him. Once he's got his hooks in you.
Yes. Thank you very much. I do not want to take too much time, but my question relates to the kind of position, or to what you said about the relation between figure and metaphor. And I mean, if I think of Nietzsche's statement that we have to believe in images, and you remember that he would say we have the task of a philosophy is just to make it possible to believe in images and to hold on, to this relation to images, and at the same time not taking the images as images. This is quite complicated. This is really a kind of impossible task. So, and I think that what Irigaray is doing, especially in her ethics of sexual difference, she would say, yes, now I kind of copy that, but I do it out of reasons of strategical reasons. And I mean, and then at the same time she brings together the question of strategy and the question of ethics. And I mean, this makes it so scary. And I would totally agree with Patricia in this point. And then I found it really kind of helpful, Penelope, that you focused on the question of the limits of both of those texts. And this would bring me, to another question, namely in which way both of them refer to, first of the concept of difference, because I mean, I would also say that Irigaray turned on some point, to a Hegelian kind of, and she says it quite explicit in her book on sexual difference. But at the same time, both of them try to think of difference as a critical, category, and without, going back to the concept of dialectics. And both of them just, combine the question or the concept of difference with sexuality, but in a very, very different way. So I think it could be very productive to think more about the way in which Nietzsche, in his way, and Irigaray, in her way, referred to sexual difference, because it's a totally different sexual difference. And it has to do with the question of how you would define your task as a philosopher, you know, to really make it kind of livable, you know, and to live for Nietzsche was not a gift or something, just, you know, it was a hard work just to stand up in the morning. And, you know, and I think one has to have this in mind, just to get a concept or an idea of what it meant for him to work with metaphors and then to turn metaphors in figures, kind of, you know, in his working with language. This is what I just wanted to. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. This is the I, have a very inappropriate relationship with Irigaray. It's like that affair you have with your Mexican gardener. I think I have a way to find us back to the race question. Wait, it gets complicated, this love affair. I'll tell you the reason why I fell in love with Irigaray briefly. It was because I thought she did this really nice trick that I like to call the abysmal reversal. She did this thing where she would flip back something on me, but it would not be an image. It would not be a copy. It would not be a speculum. It would be this place where one could lose oneself. In her book Speculum, she uses the phrase dark continent to refer to the sex that is not one. So I felt like that continent with her, and it was exciting for a little bit. The good people of Key West tell the story of one Karl Tanzler, a German biologist, who fell in love with this tuberculosis patient named Helen. She died fairly quickly after he met her, but he was so in love with her that he stole her body from the cemetery and kept her corpse for 7 years in his house and continued to practice different embalming techniques in order to keep the body from rotting away. What is not told in that story is that Helen's name was Elena. She was a Cuban immigrant, and that she did not love him back when she was alive. She did not want that man when she was alive. And yet, still to the day, you go on the tours in Key West and you will hear the story of Karl Tanzler's romantic love, and that is true passion. Irigaray, of course, in this book where she keeps Nietzsche dead, is doing one of these abysmal reversals. Imagine now if it was Helen who had kept Karl's body alive. How different a story that is. Now, if we did the same trick to Irigaray that she did to Nietzsche, perhaps we can find our way back to race. What is missing in the other reversal, the abyss that we find, race, can be found in the missing bibliographies and the missing citations that her famous formal style excludes. Frobenius, who sits right there in the middle, Leo Frobenius, a German ethnologist, who sits right there in the middle between Nietzsche and Irigaray, came up with a theory in which he said white people are animals and the African people are plants. He famously called these kind of gestalts paidumas, which some of you may know from Ezra Pound's poems today. But they were also very influential for Césaire, who we already read here in Nietzsche 13. In Paris, yeah. I was good. Yeah. In any case, this plant philosophy, which was embraced by not only Césaire, but Senghor and others who launched the negritude movement, was there available to Irigaray in her intellectual circles. Through Lacan and through others, you get direct access to these philosophies. This is part of the intellectual tradition in Europe, to understand that this plant life is associated, at least in the intellectual imaginary of the Europeans, with the dark continent. The exclusion of those references is perhaps the way for us to find her own abyss, the dark continent for her, the limit of her own dark continent, so that we can think beyond two. Because anybody who tells you beyond that thinking about 2 is harder than is an abyss forgets to tell you that thinking about 34 is also as abysmal as thinking about 2. Therefore, I'm with the young people who think in terms of intersections today. And this is the end of my comment to you about my brief and inappropriate law affair with Irigaray.
Thank you. There and there. Yes.
You want to pass the mic?
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. So I wanted to offer both an invitation and a question. We've been talking about alterity with Irigaray, but I wanted to invite our speakers today to talk about the place of alterity in Nietzsche's thought, specifically the place of alterity in the stylistic dimension of Nietzsche's thought. I think one thing that's very distinctive and unique about Nietzsche's thought is that the vast majority of Nietzsche's thought consists in the tension between different things he says. A good reader of Nietzsche is able to read and see contrasts and interesting differences between things in different aphorisms, and sees that the insight that Nietzsche is giving us is actually between these things. So an example is Nietzsche often talks very spiritedly of self-sovereignty. But what we forget is that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he also talks about the importance of allowing oneself to be overthrown, the importance of allowing oneself to be burned in flames. And so we see that there is these certain insight between the tensions of these things. And I would like to invite you to talk about the affirmation of alterity involved in this stylistic dimension. I'm thinking, for instance, of Deleuze's essay Nomad Thought. He talks about Nietzsche as someone to which we cannot attribute an interiority. But Nietzsche's thought is necessarily in contact with an exteriority. That exteriority not only being that which goes unsaid, but also that which the reader brings to the text. These are exteriorities which cannot be abstracted from, taken away from Nietzsche's writing. So on the one hand, I wanted to invite you to talk about that. And then the question that I was hoping to ask is, do you believe that Irigaray's criticisms of Nietzsche, specifically her criticisms of his neglectance of the female alterity, which is symbolized by the sea, as a couple of us have pointed out, do you think this criticism can be made, this criticism can be justifiable in recognizing the alterity of this stylistic dimension of his thought? Can we look at this alterity of the understanding that so much of Nietzsche's thought consists in what is not said, and still yet criticize him for neglecting an alterity? Insofar as I guess my question is, do we have to reduce Nietzsche's thought to the content of his thought in order to wage that criticism, or can we recognize the alterity in the stylistic dimension of his thought and still yet criticize that alterity?
Thank you very much. Because we are very short in time, can you be very concise in your question, and then we will take a few minutes from our guests who address these questions and wrap up. You have 2 of them.
Well, okay. So maybe I was very interested in this idea of the conduct of critique, and maybe perhaps to bring us back to the 2, because we're speaking about different senses of life, but not life maybe as Hegelian, like life as a living thing, but more life as a conduct. As an embodied condition, and perhaps we can start thinking sexual difference as a difference in structural set of conditions, but also, more specifically conduct. So maybe we can contrast a gesture between Nietzsche and Irigaray, and which is the affirmation of life. In The Marine Lover, she critiques Nietzsche for. She quotes this passage of Zarathustra's, "Was that life? Well then, once more." saying that you always affirm after the fact. You have extra time and you always affirm life after it is happening. Nietzsche would say that in one gesture he is both doing and affirming. The gesture itself is affirmation. In a later text, in The Wedding Between the Body and Language, Irigaray talks about the charis, and she explicitly does the yes saying, but as consent. So the yes saying comes before the gesture instead of after. She says a yes from both should precede every charis, a yes which gives permission to go beyond the limits of communal life, a yes which is proof of my consent to your approach to my body. So perhaps you could speak about this delay and what it means, saying yes after the fact, saying yes before the fact.
Thank you very much. So why don't you take a few minutes each to address some of those questions while you wrap up at the same time, maybe.
I'll start, I guess. Vered, I very much like your comments. I think that's really insightful to think about the gesture, Nietzsche as making this gesture after the fact, or Irigaray's reading of Nietzsche as affirming only after the fact, but that for Nietzsche the gesture itself is an affirmation, and I think that I prefer that reading of the eternal return to Irigaray's reading of the eternal return, which is that it is a gesture of the affirmation of life, rather than the affirmation of the return of the same, but in fact an affirmation of the difference of life, or even, I mean, to go back to some of the questions about difference, or the multiplicity. And then again, I think that one of the differences between Irigaray and Nietzsche comes down to the question of multiplicity versus the two. It comes down to the one and the many, the one and the two versus the one and the many. And it's interesting that you bring up that passage, which I was also so struck by, where she talks about consent as saying yes before, after, and I was struck by it because I've been working on the issue of consent. And reading this text again from, where I am, which I can't do otherwise, there were so many passages that also spoke to this issue of consent and the whole problematics of consent, which is in the news in terms of thinking about affirmative consent, if that's possible, what would that mean? Saying yes before rather than yes after. I mean, very problematic, and yet I think that is something that Irigaray asked for, and I think what you're pointing to is a real tension in the kind of imagined fluidity and caress and this relationship of the fluidity in the sea versus the word, where she makes that distinction between the incarnation and the word when she's talking about, when she's doing a critical analysis of Christianity. It seems that this saying yes, I mean, the saying yes, again, is to bring us back to the word, and the word as not a substitute for a gesture, but has to be the word, and consent is this kind of literal, if I dare use that, use that kind of language, this kind of literal saying yes, which is very problematic in terms of this fluid discourse, I think. But anyway, I think just very provocative and very interesting, and I don't know that I have anything interesting to say about it. But I guess I will conclude by saying that I think a lot of these remarks, to my mind, come back to this difference between Irigaray and Nietzsche's conception of difference, which is difference as multiplicity for Nietzsche and difference as two, and not, we can't get, she doesn't think we've gotten to two. And yes, it will be obviously difficult to think 34 as two, but I think she's insisting we can't even think two. So we have a long ways to go to get to thinking 34. If we can't make that one step from 1 to 2 in centuries, We still have a long way to go. And that also, rereading this spoke to me again in terms of thinking about consent, and also in terms of thinking about the political climate and the election. You know, can we, maybe Irigaray's onto something. Have we even thought to? Can we even imagine a kind of female voice of authority? I don't know. And then finally, just the comment about Deleuze and nomad thought and interiority, exteriority makes me think again about these two kind of paths forward from Nietzsche in French philosophy, that those that seem to take up the metaphorics of surface and those, or exteriority, and those like Irigaray that I think are maybe more influenced by psychoanalysis, taking up or maybe not influenced, well, I shouldn't say, but more accepting of psychoanalysis and depth. So I'll stop there.
And I would just add, actually partly just that the discussion has been very helpful. And thank you very much to the organisers. Yeah, so on difference, I think I just finishing in my own mind by just thinking about the difference between difference thought of as again as conduct, as something which makes possible that you turn up in a context or a text and you think how adequately is difference being thought here. But what I mean what I mean by that perhaps is style. And that I'm thinking about the different ways that I could give you a typology of how difference has been represented and how fully. And so the thing that I could do is I could say, well, how is difference not being represented? Could I make that gesture? And for me, that is, you know, as I was saying earlier, one of the most exciting things that Irigaray does. Not always just that it's the right gesture, but that she reminds you that it's a positive gesture, that there's this other move you can make, which is that you can arrive and locate the exclusion of difference. It's a thing to do, and you could expand it, or you could do it more, or you could think about how she doesn't fully realise that gesture, but nonetheless it's introduced as a gesture that can be made. And then another way of thinking about difference is that it's a call, you know, that something comes to us from an ethical field, and that's also something that Irigaray does. She imagines that there is a neglect of difference, and she accuses Nietzsche of neglecting difference, or she thinks of the history of philosophy of having neglected difference. To me, that's a really different kind of gesture. And the reason, I mean, part of the thing that's really interesting here is just to think about those different gestures. Like, to me, they're entirely different things to do. I think that speaks to Patricia's really helpful sort of typology of or sort of characterisation of the difference between my response and Kelly's response. That something about the way that I want to respond to her is to really hold on to the difference between differences, something you can turn up and do, like you can find its absence, you can think about how its contours are not being thought in certain ways with this particular philosopher, Irigaray. But to position it as an ethical demand, like to position something that will have been failed, that this particular account won't have been adequate to difference, that there's been a neglect, that's a different kind of project. So then for me, just thinking about that difference thing that difference can be, then would, for me, then turn it into a question of what are the conditions of those different kinds of projects. And when it becomes an ethical project, then it seems to me that Irigaray has some further work that she can do about what are the conditions of thinking about neglect of difference. You know, where does the language of neglect come from? How adequate is neglect going to be to a language of ethics? What's the genealogy of associating sort of ethics with problems of neglect? And you know, there's a lot more to do there. But to go in the project of giving a genealogy of, say, the language of neglect when you're in the domain of ethics, as opposed to the genealogy of arriving and carving out absences in form or type, those are again. It's helpful. It's more helpful to think of the differences, I think, than the similarities. And I guess I was starting off by just saying it's not only about what Nietzsche would say about difference, but it's also about the gesture that he would bring to it. And I suspect that he would be not content with stopping the analysis at the point of talking about the neglect of difference, because he would identify the register of the ethical as one which itself, you know, is a move with various histories, and, you know, involves affirmations of life or otherwise, or becomings or otherwise. You know, he'd be attentive then to what you want to say when what you're saying is, I have a story about ethics, and it's a story about how something gets neglected. So then Nietzsche has something else to do. He's got an extra thing, and she's got an extra thing when it comes to, in a sense, typing absences. And I don't think when she thinks about the exchange between Nietzsche, I don't think she holds on quite as fully. I don't think she quite gets all of the intensity, all of the capacity out of those different things to do with difference. So I guess the thing I was starting with, and the thing that I found really helpful here, was to think about this as an encounter with philosophers who can do different kinds of things with difference, and who have an awful lot of capacity in that respect, but also can call upon each other to really saturate and drain a bit further, I think, that capacity.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our guests for this fantastic session, and I want to thank you.